Welcome to your last regular lecture, that is faculty-led, substantive lecture. There will be a gathering here 4 weeks from today, which will be the last week of classes, and you're here for tours, we'll demonstrate that. The next 3 weeks, as I think you all know, you will be in smaller groups working on multi-genre projects, preparing multi-genre projects. So don't come here a week from today, unless you have with your seminar faculty pre-arranged that. Okay? Before we get started, Emily, what do we have?
Roundtable, last official roundtable today.
Last official roundtable today. Dr. Torres will be here. Anything else? Awesome. So, let me quickly introduce somebody who is familiar to some of you. It's Dr. Torres. He has a PhD in politics from the University of Colorado Boulder, and prior to that, he was a CSU alum. He was a CSU alum from Fullerton, right? You got his master's degree and your PhD.
Doctorate from CU Boulder and master's from Cal State Fullerton.
Yeah. So he's one of you. When you're a little bit further along. He's done lots of researching and publishing in a variety of fields. He's especially interested in medical and media anthropology, communication and culture, Maya studies, media production, Latin American studies. He himself has lots of rich experience creating and criticizing media production, and he himself is a documentary filmmaker. Please welcome Dr. Torres.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. What I'm going to do right now is I'm a nonlinear kind of person, so I'm going to show you a prelude of what I'm going to talk about on a frontline episode. We're going to watch a few minutes of that, and this is where I'm eventually going to get to in my talk. So let's start there. I'm going to end right there. I'm going to pick this up a little bit later, though, when we get back. But some of the things you might have realized, might have heard in that, some may have sounded familiar to a Western U.S. history, which is people wanted to take back their own government. Sounds like our beginning a little bit in the United States. Today I'm going to talk about political duplicity and the illusory self-imaging in the United States of the 1950s. My orienting questions are, what is emblematic of the United States identity as citizens of the U.S., and how have cultural insiders and outsiders described the American ethos and character? Why are the 1950s in America a pivotal decade for identity misrecognition between how U.S. citizens thought of themselves versus how international policies of the U.S. government were implemented through clandestine and sometimes covert operations? How does one U.S. multinational company represent the changes in American identity and our international footprint abroad? And finally, how did the actions of the U.S. government in the 1950s lead to the Iranian Revolution and to the cultural changes in Iran described in the graphic novel Persepolis that we're going to be reading this week? To answer these questions, I'd like to briefly outline some of the national character traits of the U.S. from insider and outsider observations. So let's get started. First of all, I have some keywords for you that I'm going to be mentioning. Duplicity, which is this idea, contrariness or doubleness of thought or speech. Protean, a word I'm sure no one's probably heard of, but yet we're very much American, a very much American term. Exceedingly variable, readily assuming different shapes and forms. Méconnaissance, to misconstrue or misrecognize, and provincial, the characteristics of the inhabitants of a province, not cosmopolitan, limited or narrow in outlook. And finally, coup d'etat, the sudden overthrow of a government. So we start with American identity. Really starts, I think, at the American Revolution. We have some really great pictures of how we celebrate our original identity, with the surrender of Cornwallis after the siege of Yorktown, the Battle of Trenton, the death of General Warren. All of these things celebrating the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, the generals that were most praised were the individualists, the crafty, especially the Southern generals, crafty, woodsman-like generals, always individual. And we also have a really interesting view here. The Tea Party, of course, which spawned the American Revolution. One of the things people don't realize about this Tea Party is the tea that they're throwing over that ship right there belonged to the Dutch East India Company, a monopoly. Americans didn't like monopolies. They didn't like these international companies that had no democratic control, that were dictating the powers, the empire of the world. So back then, we wanted independent economies as well. Some of the first people, one of the first persons, I guess, to talk about American identity was this guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. In his book, Democracy in America, he characterizes Americans as calm and considered people, disposed to isolate themselves from the mass of the fellows and to withdraw into a circle and family and friends. So he thought Americans were very individualistic. And he said that basically nuclear family is probably more important to us than our status or community in America. He also defined Americans for our ability to remold ourselves around the opportunity that we have a protean nature, that we're shapeshifters, that we're able to rise above. We have social mobility in the United States. And he thought that was really wonderful about us. And so many of our symbols talk about this self-reliance and independence, from Atlas in front of the Chrysler Building to Ralph Waldo Emerson writing Self-Reliance in a 1941 essay. I think one of the persons in our history that really reflects this individualism and innovation is Walt Disney, who was born in 1901. Now, Walt Disney had his own company by the age of 19, and he had already failed at that company when he was 21. He picked up himself by his bootstraps, created another company, and did okay, moved to Hollywood, got some contracts, but where he really broke it open was with this cartoon, Mickey Mouse, called Steamboat Willie. He had a great innovation that he put in this cartoon. It was called sound. They didn't have sound in the cartoons up till then, and he put all these great effects in Steamboat Willie, and he was internationally famous almost overnight. One of the things he created during the 1950s, some years later, I'm going to talk about the national identity now of the 1950s, is Disneyland. Now, Disneyland was finished in 1954. It was presided over by Walt Disney. It was kind of rough how it came out at first. It was 160 acres that had been orange groves in Orange County, for those of you who've never been there. It was an interesting place. It had been, orange groves had been transformed into the ultimate playground for children, a place where adventure and fable cobbled together American mythologies, from pirates to the valorization of science, to carnival rides and scale-modeled versions of classic Euro-American fairy tales and children's stories. In other words, Disney was kind of re-imaging the United States, our past, our legacy, in his own terms and in his own vision. One of the things that he created in this Disneyland is a scale model of Main Street, a typical Main Street in the US, the 2/3 version. It's inspired by Marceline, Missouri, a town in which Walt Disney had grown up, and Fort Collins, Colorado, where I've been before. It's a lovely town. But these were visions of towns in about the turn of the century, 20th century, 1908. That's how Walt Disney wanted to project America to Americans. This simple place, small town feel, provincial in its ways. For younger visitors, it's an adventure turning back the calendar to the days of their grandfather's youth. So the first vista of Disneyland upon entering the park again was Main Street, a pain to nostalgia, a remembrance of a small town America free of labor strikes and civil strife. During this time, actually, Walt Disney Studios was undergoing a labor strike right around this time. He didn't want that in Walt Disneyland. An imaginary place where racial tensions were also sublimated, where industry was neighborly, where the town citizens created their roles in society through the ever individual nature of the American spirit. One of the series that he created was Davy Crockett, which is emblematic then of a history of an individual representing this individualist experience and spirit of the United States. It's a 5-part serial, shot in 1-hour episodes. Starred Fess Parker and Buddy Ebsen. I saw it in reruns later in the 60s and 70s. What it doesn't mention, of course, in this series is Davy Crockett's demise and defeat at the Alamo. It's never really mentioned. That unpleasantness is never mentioned in this series, of course. Elitism. It also doesn't really talk about Davy Crockett's kind of socialist sort of bent. You know, he didn't like elitism whatsoever. He didn't like elitism in the military. He also didn't like the removal of Native Americans from their homeland, and he railed against that in Congress. Very unpopular decision back then as well. Another thing that Disney did, though, was he sanitized these ancient folk tales that we have. And one really good example of that is Sleeping Beauty. And I don't know if you guys know the story of Sleeping Beauty, of course. The princess goes to sleep. The prince comes over and he kisses her. And then that's pretty much the end of that movie, that Disney movie. And she awakes and they live happily ever after. Well, actually, the story of Sleeping Beauty is in 2 parts from the Grimm's fairy tales. And if Disney were to film the second part, it would go something like this. After the wedding, the princess continues to visit her. The prince continues to visit his bride. She bears him 2 children, unbeknownst to his mother, who's an ogre. So the prince's mother is an ogre, it turns out. That's a little unpleasant. The ogre queen mother sends the young queen and the children to a house secluded in the woods and directs her cook, so this ogre, to prepare the boy, to prepare her children as dinner. So there's a little bit of carnivorousness here and cannibalism. Kind-hearted cook substitutes a lamb for the boy, which satisfies the queen mother. Now, this would have been really interesting, I think, in Disney as they cut open a lamb on the cartoons, substituting that for the boy that would have been killed. She then demands the girl this time, and substitutes a young goat. The cook does anyway. This satisfies the queen mother. When the ogre demands that he serve up the young queen, the latter offers to slit her throat so that she may join the children that she imagines are dead, etc. However, the queen mother discovers the trick going on. The king returns. The good thing about this whole story, part 2, Sleeping Beauty, is the king and young queen and children live happily ever after some carnage, some minor details like that. What I want to say is that during the 1950s, Disney really tried to kind of sanitize, first of all, these old folk narratives, but he also envisioned America as a small town America. He never imagined, first of all, what Disney would become. Now, Disney Company started off as one owner with his brother, a family operation. Very innovative, but very, very tied very closely to Disney's vision of what animation should really look like. Years later, then, we have Disney as a company morphing, perhaps now into an empire. Now we have Disney owning Buena Vista Home Video, Buena Vista International, Disney Stores, the Walt Disney World Company, ABC, 37% of A&E, 80% of ESPN. And these are kind of recent here. Pixar. Well, Lucasfilm's not so recent, but Lucasfilm, they just bought Lucasfilm. What this suggests then is that Disney Company has really become one of those media empires, one of 4 or 5 media empires controlling 80% of the media world. It's been transfigured from a small town, small company with a really narrow vision of what cartoons and media should be, to a multinational empire that controls much of the media output for the rest of the world. There have been some critics of America in the past that see kind of a little bit of moral hypocrisy, I think, in what America says about itself and then what it actually does in practice. And one of these critics we actually sent for, his name was Carl Gunnar Myrdal. He was a Swedish Nobel laureate economist, received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his pioneering work in the theory of money, etc. But he's best known for his study of race relations in America with his book, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in the Modern Democracy. And this study was eventually very influential in the 1954 landmark case of U.S. Supreme Court versus Brown versus the Board of Education, which really kick-started the civil rights era. So this book itself kind of was the precursor and the reckoning for what we had to see as our moral failings in the United States with regard to race relations. He characterized the problem of race relations as a dilemma in America because of a perceived conflict between high ideals, embodied in what he called the American creed on the one hand and poor performance on the other. In generations since the Civil War, the U.S. had been unable to put its human rights ideals into practice for the African American tenth of the population. Now, of course, that's what the Civil War was kind of fought over, this sort of moral dilemma that we had, right? This moral idea of what do we do with slavery, with the abolitionists in the North saying, do without it, Southerners saying we can't live without it. During the 1950s, we had some identity issues as well, a little bit of moral hypocrisy, and this has been written about by many different authors. One of them is Pat Buchanan, and one of my students has pointed this out to me. And one of the things I want to tell all of you students as well is that, you know, I've appreciated giving what I thought was my sort of take on academics for you and all these subjects, but I'm also listening to you, and I'm also learning from you constantly. So much of my course content is based on what students actually give me. But this is a really interesting right-wing writer who I don't agree with a lot, but I think he's right on this issue in a sense that he wrote this book, Republic, Not an Empire. This is Pat Buchanan. And what he says is he makes a compelling case for the United States to adhere to armed neutrality and strategic independence. He says that the Federalists in 1798 argued for that as well. That was part of our kind of founding creed. In the United States, we were non-interventionists starting off, although we quickly went into interventions by the year 1800 with the Barbary Coast pirates in a limited way. For the most part, we were non-interventionists. So he argues that America should get back to being a republic and stop acting like an empire. And one of the things he says, we should disentangle ourselves from UN, NATO, and various globalist commitments. I think that's personally wrong. I think that's a great place to discuss things, is to use NATO and stuff like that. To have consent over military operations, to me, is not a bad idea. But then he goes on to say that we should avoid the 20th century's obsession with reckless intervention abroad. And he says, stripping the presidency of the war powers usurped from the Congress, codified in the War Powers of 1973, he says that act itself sought to limit the presidency's abuses, but it did something else in 1973. It codified and legitimized past unconstitutional precedents that we went through. So another great book that talks about this sort of hypocrisy in American policy, and that is The Brothers. It's a book at the 1950s Secretary of State and CIA director, both brothers under the Eisenhower administration. Coincidentally, the Secretary of State was a lawyer who supported many of the big multinational corporations of this day, corporations who had land ownings in places like Guatemala in the Middle East and oil. So he was an advocate for big business before he became Secretary of State. He had kind of a position. But when the Cold War is at its peak, two immensely powerful brothers in the United States went into a series of foreign adventures, as they say, propelled by quintessentially American set of fears and delusions. The Dulles brothers launched violent campaigns against foreign leaders they saw as a threat to the United States, and these campaigns helped to push countries from Guatemala to the Congo into long spirals of violence, led the United States into the Vietnam War, and led the foundation for decades of hostility between the United States and countries from Cuba into the Middle East, including Iran. Why is that? Well, they usually installed pro-American governments. Quite often, these were colonels. In fact, we have a term for that, the colonalistas, in history. And so often then these colonels became tyrants and started usurping their own identity. They started eliminating democratic reforms in their own countries as well. And we were okay with that. Well, here's a list of the U.S. involvement in regime change from the late 40s to 1971. There's so many things we got involved with. This is all coming out now with the Freedom of Information Act. So we're able to actually see what the CIA did during the 50s and 60s and how they changed the world, basically, world politically, the days that we have now. One of the things you'll see right there that's really important is 1953, Iranian coup d'etat. We changed the government in Iran. Guatemalan coup d'etat, 1954. I don't think it even mentions actually a lot of the, well, very briefly, some of the South Vietnamese coup in 1963 as well that propelled us into the Vietnamese War, or part of it at least. Let me talk really briefly about the Guatemalan coup d'etat. It basically was, I'll ignore this slide for the sake of time. The Guatemalan coup d'etat basically was a democratic government elected in Guatemala, and the president was thinking of nationalizing some of the industries there. And the United Fruit really didn't like that. United Fruit Company, who were in close contact with the Secretary of State. And so what Dulles, Secretary of State, ended up doing, because of communist fears and the changing of that country to communism, they went in and staged a coup, and they actually the CIA broadcast over radio stations, said, your country is under siege. And they created basically a fake revolution with about 400 CIA officers and some other personnel. It was so effective, this kind of subterfuge and this kind of fake revolution that they instigated, that the president at that time feared for his life, and he thought the U.S. armed forces in Guatemala were defecting and were going to come and raid. So it was the most deceptive, I think, one of the most deceptive changes of government that I think the United States has ever been through. And to this day, I think it's described as a definitive death blow to democracy in Guatemala. The coup was widely criticized internationally, contributed to long-lasting anti-U.S. sentiments in Latin America as well. Also, what it did was eventually led to civil war in Guatemala. Let's shift a little bit to Iranian history, going up to Persepolis, the book you're going to read. It was in 1908 that the British had an intense interest in Iranian oil in Iran, the Persian areas. The territory was kind of being looked at and taken over by private interests. One company that had make a major impact there was a British petroleum company. The book Persepolis, though, talks about one particular leader who's not Iranian. I want to really clarify really quickly who that was. It was a guy named Ataturk. Now, Ataturk, the Ottoman Empire basically shrunk in Turkey, shrunk after World War I. It was an old Islamic regime of a caliphate. Well, Ataturk took control of it, and he made these major changes to Turkey. He modernized the country instantly. He created education and voting rights for women, civil and political reform in Turkey. Women could take off the veil for the first time in Turkey. And all of the secularism spread over the Middle East, and it caught fire. And it couldn't be denied. So Iran actually had a leader come into place in 1925, Iran's Reza Khan, who became Shah. Shah means nothing but king in Persian. So in 1925, he came into office, but he had this influence behind him of Ataturk. So he invited reform as well. He modernized Iran. Eventually, another Shah came into office, Mohammad Reza Shah. And he formed a political constitutional monarchy. He increased political power, though, by convening the Iranian Assembly in 1949 and finally formed a Senate. However, the new senators in Iran were largely supportive of Pahlavi as he had intended. So he created a government that was for him, and he quashed dissent, as you saw in that video. He created a secret police force that quashed any sort of democratic reform from underneath. What I'd like to do right now, though, if I could, is just play the latter part of that video that I had played originally. A couple of things really struck me, and it struck you, I think, in that video. One of them was that the people of Iran are smart enough to parse out, to divide the people from the United States from the government of the United States. As this reporter said, I think he went into these political rallies thinking that he actually might get harmed. What he found was that people actually said, as they said, we love American people. We don't have an issue with American people. I think one of the reasons for that is because the rest of the world knows what the American creed is all about, right? That we accept foreigners. You have that Statue of Liberty. We're about democracy innately, right? This whole history that we have embedded within our identity is there, and they recognize that. But they also recognize that historically, the U.S. government has done these interventionist policies in the Middle East for the gain of the petroleum industry and material assets, and that bothers them. It bothers them that we gave refuge to the Shah of Iran, who committed genocide against his own people in 1979. When I was young, 1979, I remember that happening, and my impression of the whole situation was, wow, those Iranian monsters. What in fact was Iranians being fired up about the revolution and what we did. To my knowledge, I don't think one hostage during that hostage crisis in 1979 was actually harmed. So there was a lot of restraint, actually. Eventually, they were all freed when Ronald Reagan made a secret deal and got them all released when he came into office. My conclusion is the America of the 1950s was a time when the popular self-imaging of our nation was structurally at odds with some of the political subterfuge lies in communist paranoia that overtook the Eisenhower presidency during this time. When U.S. international political intervention was to remap the world and set the stage for the next half century, CIA political coups put in place, pro-U.S. business dictators in countries around the world who would eventually lead their countries into civil war, ethnic conflict, by economic favoritism of one group over another, genocide, and political instability. And this is still going on in the world today. One of the things that was mentioned in that video that was really crucial too, in 1979, Shia and Sunni Muslims got along fairly well. Up until that point, there was no sort of ethnic division between those to speak of, no ethnic conflict going on in the Middle East. 1979 came along, and Muslim governments came into place, then you saw a little bit of a divide between the Saudi Arabia Sunni factions of the Middle East and the Shia or Iranian divisions of Islam. My reach is this. The United States of America has had a personality disorder of a kind. It's on one hand founded upon the principle of being an independent sovereign nation. We fought a war of independence from an imperialistic country. Our citizens are protean but principled. Our founders espoused enlightenment values and ethics, but the U.S. and the U.S. policies of the government of the people have been contradictory, imperialistic, and full of hypocrisy. We suffer from kind of a méconnaissance in the U.S. or a misrecognition. No other decade highlights the contradictions in the U.S. national character more than the America of the 1950s. We start off as a rebellious government wanting democracy. In the 1950s, we were taking over democracies and installing tyrannies. Very ironic time. Within the world, though, an environmental tipping point with ethnic conflict and enduring of the world. It's up to the new generation of citizens to revitalize what the U.S. stands for in the world, but also ensure what we say about ourselves and our high ideals and standards in practice. We have policymakers we can rely upon to suit these needs. We do need policymakers, rather, to put in place to suit these needs. And if I were to say anything about, in this last lecture of this semester for you, about any sort of activism that you can get involved with, in your generation in particular, what I would suggest is that start with voting. People in my generation, I remember when I was young, I was kind of lazy about voting as well. In the United States, we have a voting population of about 50%. That was in the last election. You know what I'm gearing up for? What I want to remind you of, if you're one of the 5 in your generation that votes, get those other 4 people into the polls. Change your nation. Get involved. This is the best way you can change things. Now I'm going to end with, we're all in this together.